Hi, my name is Blue Jay Walker, local flim-flam man and dubious artist, and in this video I'm going to undertake the incredible challenge of writing 71 poems in a 24-hour period, all while living on top of a mountain. Yep, I'm sure this'll go great.
Taking my typewriter up this.
Either that or I die trying. Well, I'm sure I won't die.
A pair of gloves wouldn't have been a bad thing to bring.
But before we get there, let's break down the artistic foundations for this challenge to help it all make a little bit of sense. First, the why. This challenge engages in several different artistic practices quite nicely all at once. If you're watching at home, I'd encourage you to try it out for yourself, but I'm not actually going to encourage you to do that until you watch the whole video, because there's some things you need to know about what happens on the tail end. The first practice is the act of expulsion, or draining oneself of every preconceived notion, idea, or pretense until you can only farm the truth for your creative practice. The theory is as follows. By forcing yourself to create a large body of work in a short period of time, you effectively strip away all pretenses, crutches, or forms of habit until you are left with nothing but the most raw and honest implements for your tools of creation, because you have, frankly, nothing left to draw on but the honest truth. The timeline of 24 hours helps you assert the need to dig into real, honest, vulnerable creative work, because if you allow yourself more time in between creative outbursts, you are also undoubtedly allowing more time for you to build more walls against vulnerability. So it is that we create the first part of this challenge, 71 poems in 24 hours.
A lot of people were very curious about how it is that I get such long rolls of paper, and the answer is I don't. I make them myself, because no, there's no one making typewriter-sized rolls of paper. You gotta find big, huge rolls of paper and cut it down.
Oh, yes, perfect. Oh, this last section is not cut at all. There we go. Flawless.
But why on top of a mountain? In Susan Sontag's essay, The Pornographic Imagination, there lives a quote that has altered my brain chemistry and lifestyle choices, for better or worse, permanently. I will share part of it with you here. And stick with me here, it gets a little bit dense, but I promise I'll pull you up before you run out of breath, alright? Alright. Art and art making is a form of consciousness. In daily life, we may acknowledge a moral obligation to inhibit such states of consciousness in ourselves, not only to maintain social order, but to allow the individual to maintain humane contact with other persons. It's well known that when people venture into the far reaches of consciousness, they do so at the peril of their sanity. But the human scale, or humanistic standard proper to ordinary life and conduct, seems misplaced when applied to art. If within the last century, art has come to be invested with an unprecedented stature, the nearest thing to a sacramental human activity acknowledged by secular society, it is because one of the positions art has assumed is making forays into and taking up positions on the frontiers of consciousness, often very dangerous to the artist as a person, and reporting back what's there. Being a freelance explorer of spiritual dangers, the artist gains a certain license to behave differently from other people, matching with the singularity of his vocation. His job is inventing trophies of experience. His credentials and spiritual authority ultimately depend on the audience's sense, whether something known or inferred, of the outrages he commits upon himself. The exemplary modern artist is a broker in madness. That's a particularly heady text, so allow me to illustrate a little bit easier exactly what it means through this challenge. The challenge, again, is to write 71 poems in under 24 hours, all while locked at the top of a mountain. In an attempt to push myself into a new state of consciousness, a state of consciousness which I will then use to create trophies of experience for the public, allowing them to partake in the experience of pressing into unknown spiritual dangers without ever actually having to do it themselves, I'm going to put myself into a physically precarious position. You might think the so-called spiritual act of making art and the physical act of being in a precarious position do not affect each other whatsoever, but I promise you, they do in more ways than you can really measure.
These peaks right here are where I'm headed, and to be honest, it's not actually that far, but it is steep, which while I'm carrying a tripod, camera, and typewriter, is going to be interesting, so we'll see how long it takes.
I'm going to hike up a mountain with a typewriter, pack too much weight and too little food. I won't pack a tent, just a sleeping bag and tarp, and alongside it I'll pack 2 sandwiches, 1 cheese and bologna and 1 peanut butter and jam. That's it. Also a water bottle, I'm not a maniac.
Alright, well we are in rock climbing territory and there's not technically any trails up there, so I'm just gonna have to pick my way around, but I figure there's a big set of rock and hill, then a valley, and then another set of mountain. And that second set of mountain is the one I'm trying to hit the peak of. So for the first one, I'm gonna try and choose the path of least resistance. As little peakage as possible. I think I'm gonna sneak around the right side, which is what you're about to see.
The initial hike was not inherently difficult, though doing it twice, once with the bag and typewriter and once with the camera, did hamper my progress a little bit.
We're making good progress, as expected, sneaking our way over the first hump, and then I think we're hitting the beginning of the second valley after this little dip here.
But rather quickly, and as can be expected when hiking up a mountain, the grade of the hill steepened. Despite the heat, I was wary of drinking too much water as I only brought the one water bottle and didn't want to die of heat stroke and dehydration on the way back down. That would be just embarrassing. Write 71 poems and then don't make it down the mountain? Come on, grow up a little.
Alright, now I might be losing my mind, but I'm pretty sure that block right there is the top of the mountain that I'm supposed to be heading to. So, we might be about halfway, which is nice. I seem to be making pretty good progress. My plan now is to sneak my way down the bottom of this ravine, weave my way up to the top of that saddle, and I should be able to pick either that boulder or that boulder to set up shop on. I'll probably check out both of them. Anyways, I'll see you at the top.
All of this was to be expected, but it was only once I reached the boulder field that the troubles truly began. First, there were several scouting trips up and down as I attempted to find a route that was plausible for both me, my typewriter, and my unevenly weighted bag to make it up.
Angle's getting aggressive. You can tell because you can't even see me. Alright, I think we're nearly at the peak. It starts getting really scrambly though, so I'm gonna crawl up there first without all of my gear, and then, if it's the right peak, I'm gonna bring all the gear up. Whew, better be the right peak. 'Cause if not, I have to do it all again. Taking my typewriter up this, it's gonna go great. Nothing could go wrong.
I hadn't, in all earnestness, expected this to be quite the challenge it was, but the rock faces at the peak's edge proved to be fairly difficult to manage with a 20-pound typewriter unbalancing me at every step of the way.
Alright, I made it up to the very top of the mountain, and I'm not gonna lie, when I was going up, I was like, oh, I'll just act like it's a really scary scramble and kind of over-dramatize it, but nope! There are some spots that I'm not excited to go up with a typewriter and a heavy backpack. So, we'll see how that goes, but it's definitely the right mountaintop. It's highest you can see in the area. The view is gorgeous.
My limited to intermediate experience with rock climbing has taught me one crucial idea, that at any moment, even when you think you're safe while climbing a wall, it can all go wrong. And any additional variable, such as a heavy, fragile object that constantly throws you off balance, is not to be taken lightly.
We're right near the peak. This next part is genuinely the only part that I'm not sure about, that scares me a little bit. It's significantly steeper than the other sections I've had. There's less of a fall zone, like the other sections that I've been kind of scrambling up. We're genuinely on the side of a cliff, so it's like, oh, if you do fall, you're gonna fall a long way, but it wasn't really a problem. I was basically just walking with a little bit of hop, skip, and jumping. This part is a genuine scramble, but if I fall, I'll just fall on rocks, so it's no problem. Oh, let's see. All right, okay.
As I scale these wind-carved rocks, it may occur to you that I could have just as easily done this challenge from, say, an open field or beside a lazy river, happily watching the days go by. But there is also an artistic precedence for those who choose to press into the harder-to-reach areas of the world in order to create their art, rather than allowing themselves to simply stay in the meadow. Suffice it to say, there is an intrinsic difference between the art which will be created when you are beside a lazy river in an open field, and the art that will be made when you are being buffeted by wind at the top of a rocky peak. And you may not be able to quantify that difference, but we're artists, not mathematician-matricians.
I'm not gonna lie, I've carried some silly things up mountains before, but whew, this one was tough.
After reaching the peak, I took a short rest in order to cool down and then began scouring the ridgeline for a suitable flat spot on which to set up shop. Once I have arrived at the top, I will not allow myself to leave the peak until I have written 71 poems. Over the course of the first 70, I will drain myself of all my previous intuitions, literary aspirations, and ideas. There's a meditation practice when you're trying to center yourself which follows the pattern of acknowledging every thought that arrives and releasing it. I will be doing this through the means of poetry. Every thought, idea, and notion I have will go into a poem, and once it is written down, it will be released and gone. You repeat this process ad nauseum until there is nothing left to interrupt your thoughts. This will be the process of my poetry until poem 71. Once I've become an open vessel empty of all previously conceived notions, poem number 71 will no longer be mine, but the mountains. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We actually have to get up there first. The sun was already lowering. It had taken significantly longer to make it to the top of the peak than I expected. The message was clear. If I wanted to succeed before I ran out of my 2 sandwiches, I'd have to work quickly. I knew that once the sun set, the temperature would drop rapidly, and what's worse, there was a windstorm coming. At the moment, the air was placid and sweet, but it's not in the desert's nature to stay that way for long. I set to work. The first 30 poems were easy. They rose quickly from the surface of my consciousness and pooled onto the fresh scroll in hard ink. At first, as is to be expected, it was largely poems about my present location and space.
Yes, the hallowed grounds are all shattered with beer bottles now. I love what you've done with the place. Burning tin cans like offerings to Henry Ford, but from the view of the sun, it's the same old mountain, unblemished. Astral eyes cannot see the impact of mealworms digging through a bucket.
To extrapolate on the purpose of this challenge, the practice of writing the poems is not to analyze every single one, why I wrote it, how it came about, what its literary merit is, but rather to establish the fact that I have removed that idea from my mind by excreting it onto the page. Sorry for using the word excrete, it's just what came to mind. Let's all move on now. It then goes to follow that the first poems you will write are often about the present space, whether that be physically or emotionally, as you empty yourself of what is most obvious first. Then, in the latter half of the first 30, I found the concepts begin to open up more, as I had to reach farther afield for inspiration within myself. The poems became an amalgam of my present thought processes, reacting with current events, and blending all with the physical space that I currently occupy.
Tumbleweed guerrilla army careening through downtown LA, a thrilling marketing ploy from a tired-eyed Mother Nature to remind us of what once was. Tumbleweed Funko Pops were created to celebrate the occasion. Record sales in the first week, 3 new factories opened to supply the demand. They print tumbleweeds on shirts like Che Guevara, and far below the crust of the earth, she cannot help but laugh. In the desert, a man prays for the clouds, and in the forest, his prayers are answered. A 100-foot tree is sailing down the river, begging the man to become more specific.
The sun continued to lower as I pressed past poem number 30. The words began pulling from memories beyond the present space, both mine and others.
Never wake up to footsteps when you don't have a doorbell, or door, or lock, or bed, only weary closed eyes pressed into the sunken frame of a pre-shrunk head. All the swallows already are fighting for love, howling in the morning sun, and you woke up to footsteps, key jangles, billy club, emblazoned with the words, "You are not allowed to be here anymore."
The poem still came quickly, but the subject matter varied further as I began pulling from less and less likely pools of inspiration. By the time I hit poem 40, the concepts were becoming more abstract. Metaphors were mixing with unfamiliar ideas as I continually widened my net.
The earth turning golden grapples with the sentiment that one day it may be no more than a dusty Oscar statue, awarded to whichever fool was most willing to press the button.
The sun continued to drop lower and lower in the sky, and I was pushed fervently on by the knowledge that the cold would soon be arriving.
The sound carried miles but no meaning inside it. Empty calories, the prairies flatlined like our aspirations, empty memories. There was a small farm, all RVs and trailers parked, the trash collecting to its edges, the only windbreak in centuries of distance. The sound carries miles. I can hear the speaker blare while they work. Every 15 minutes, a Spotify ad.
The wind, too, began to pick up. It was pleasant at first, how it lifted the scroll in fanciful ways, but soon it gained a dangerous edge, leading me to weigh down my printed words with rocks. This, combined with an extra aggressive blast of wind, caused the scroll to rip in two. So I rolled up the already typed out section, stored it, and pressed on. Darkness was approaching, and I had to move quick. By 60, some of the poems began to take on rather frank and honest expressions of my own personal situation, an aspect of poetry which I'm not usually accustomed to. I do tend to write poems for other people and not myself, so to write poems so directly about my own ideas, concepts, and places in the world felt slightly alien, but I continued to press in. After all, 60 poems deep, what else did I have to write about?
It's a tailor-made suit for the urchin, all the right holes in the most modest locations that he might elicit sympathy and never scorn as he proffers his hands and you say, "I'm sorry, I don't carry cash anymore."
The cold came in with a bitter swiftness. My fingers began to shake, even more than they usually do, as I attempted to continue writing with a mind that had been scraped of every obvious idea. There grew a desperation clawing to get out at the back of my mind. This is because as I watched the sunset, I knew I was well and truly locked at the top of the peak until its return. Remembering how difficult the ascent had been in the daylight, it was clear to me that getting off this rock in the middle of the night was not an option. So the wind grew, and with it, the knowledge that I was ill prepared for the storm that was clearly brewing. Despite this, I kept writing.
Always there is precious little time left, how it burns holes in your hands, the many ideas which scream for escape and find themselves cast, like lemmings, off of cliffs, in the hopes our documentary ratings will improve.
By the time I finished poem number 70, my entire body was beginning to shiver. Pushed to the edge, I ripped the page out of the typewriter and began fumbling with it, trying desperately to roll it up so that I could start packing up and getting ready to go somewhere warmer. Which, to be clear, that's a somewhere warmer that doesn't exist, but I still wanted to get there. At the conclusion of day one, I had finished exactly one poem short of my goal. 70 poems out of 71 completed. Now, having written 70 poems in such a short period of time, I was empty of all my own ideas and predilections. At this point, all I had to do was survive the night and listen to the mountain, waiting for it to tell me what to write. As it turns out, surviving the night was not as simple as just rolling out my mat and falling asleep. With my headlamp on, I crawled a few feet below the ridgeline, looking for a place that might be at least somewhat protected from the wind. I thought I found it and started setting up. I was wrong, but I didn't realize that until far too late. The place I laid my bed was on a heavy angle leading towards a sharpish valley of bulging rocks. Probably if I went to sleep and accidentally rolled over the edge, I would only fall a couple of feet before I was stopped by some jagged outcropping, but that didn't stop my fight or flight reflexes from jolting me with adrenaline every time I rolled so much as an inch closer to the edge of the cliff. This was a minor issue, however, and as the night progressed, I could feel the ground beneath me beginning to flatten as my body adjusted to it. The real problem was the wind. It seemed as though the small pitted ravine I had made my ramshackle abode in was not in fact a wall against the wind, but rather a funnel for it. You can trust me when I say I've been through worse, but you can also trust me when I say I didn't sleep that night. That's okay though, because my goal wasn't in earnest to sleep, it was to listen to the mountain, to accept its demands, and prepare them for ink. At midnight, I had to exit my thin cocoon sleeping bag in order to grab my tripod, not to set up a camera shot, but to weigh down the tarp that I had on top of me, because I'd run out of other rocks to weigh it down, and the wind was still trying to take it away. At 2 a.m., 3 ghosts, all in mountaineering jackets with shepherd staffs at their side, apparated in front of me, but before I was able to hear anything they said, a bitter gust of wind took them away. At 3 a.m., I screamed the wind's true name at the top of my lungs. This did nothing. With nothing else to do, I continued to hold on. At every large spurt of wind, I'd eject my hands from the sleeping bag and hold down the tarp for fear that it would fly away, and immediately I would feel the nerve endings on my fingers begin to cut loose. Each time I felt my fingers going numb, a thought occurred to me. I really should have packed gloves. Wouldn't have taken up much space. Just didn't think of it. The mountain howled, its thin brush line snapping back and forth, nearly pulling itself up from the roots. But I remained, and though the wind didn't slow down, eventually the air around me began to lighten. The signs of sunlight were coming. I continued to shiver under the tarp regardless, unwilling to rise until the sun had truly grappled its way above the peaks. The second I pulled myself out of my sleeping bag, my ever-exposed extremity began to lose its nerve endings. This I counted as a small grace, because really, what else was I gonna do? Feel all the cold? No thanks. The sun was shining, but a torrential wind ripped away any warmth possible before it could dig underneath my skin. I packed my bag haphazardly. I was desperate to escape the whipping air that I had been subjected to for hours on end, but I still had to complete my goal before I would be allowed to leave. The entire day before, I had emptied myself of all previous thoughts, and all night I had listened to the mountain's demands, its howling wind, its harsh attitude. So for one final time, I pulled out my typewriter case, and in the bright morning air, I wrote poem number 71. It reads as follows.
Moreover, thou shalt make the tabernacle with 50 sections of finely curated necessity. Eyes appeal and cunning work, thou shalt make them length of one hall, 100 paces, and there shall be 4 to ring its inner path, meeting at right angles, and thou shalt make loops of logic in the hunt for what is needed, sending each seeker always to every corner of the tabernacle, and thou shalt make the wares of unknown provenance, simple and emblazoned with markings declaring both their worth and their cheapness, and the remnant that remaineth of the goods which are tarnished before the date ascribed to them shall be compact in the back of the tabernacle, that none may partake of their failings. Thou shalt make doodads and gizmos, and line them at knee height. Thou shalt make brand names of sweet things, and place them at eye level. Thou shalt make the court of the tabernacle. For the south side there shall be asphalt, and likewise north, east, and west. North, east, and west. And take thou unto thee from among the children of the earth a separate people, that they may minister to me beneath the fluorescent panel lights, and thou shalt make holy garments for them, thy people, for glory and beauty. And these are the garments which they shall wear, a vest of blue velvet, shoes, plain pants, a blouse or shirt, lacking any markings which may cause offense. And they shall take gold, credit, debit, and their eyes will always watch for product shrinkage, and their hands will always turn the gizmos and doodads to face front and knee height, and they shall bear on them name tags which swear their allegiance, and the mountains will be but a memory of time.
Well, your guess is as good as mine, but one thing's for certain. I wouldn't have written that if the mountain didn't tell me to.